all the others did.
The Muslims have been represented as the victims and the Serbs as the aggressors. It should be remembered, however, the first blood shed in the struggle was Serb blood. 2 Muslim gunmen and 1 Croat stalked a Serb Orthodox wedding party in the heart of old Sarajevo. The father of the groom was killed. The Orthodox priest was wounded.
The killing of Nikola Gardovic on March 1st was a prelude to the war in Sarajevo. Despite promises from the government, the killers, who were well known, were not arrested. The following day, roadblocks were set up by both Muslims and Serbs. Unable to protect their civilian population, Serbs began to insist that predominantly Serbian areas of the city be controlled by their own police, or that Sarajevo become a UN protectorate. Muslims insisted on the Izetbegovic government's right to control not only Sarajevo, but all of Bosnia. To get the West to intervene, they needed to persuade Western public opinion that the Serbs were aggressors.
If you know the history, which most reporters don't know, you can very easily see them as the aggressors.
And the American press corps, the diplomatic corps, and also the foreign correspondents themselves are heavily influenced by what is said and what is done in Washington, D.C. What the State Department says is the most important thing.
In his autobiography, U.S. Secretary of State James Baker says that he instructed his press secretary, Margaret Tutwiler, to help Bosnian Foreign Minister Haris Silajdžić utilize Western mass media to build support in Europe and North America for the Bosnian cause.
But at the Times and the Post, and at the networks, big TV networks, there was clearly a pro-Bosnian Muslim bias. They were buying much of what the Bosnian Muslims said, and they were egging their reporters on because it made a better story. It's a simpler story if it's a Serb Holocaust against the Muslims than if it is a civil war with atrocities on both sides. Even if we find out when there's a real reckoning of what happened, that a preponderance of, or a higher proportion of the atrocities were committed by the Serbs, it doesn't mean it wasn't a civil war. It doesn't mean that there weren't two sides of the story.
This is part of our history, it's part of our culture, it's promoted by the entertainment industry, and so in the scene of Bosnia we had to have a good guy and a bad guy, and we like to have a victim. So it was very easy there to say, wait a minute, the Muslims are the victims, the Serbs are the bad guys, and the Croatians are kind of the good guys because they're like us and so on.
There was a sense that some of their reporting was censored to a certain line which was anti-Serb, as opposed to actually trying to create balance of what the Bosnians were doing at the same time.
The press would have us believe that the Serbs have seized 2/3 of Bosnia. The fact is the Serbs have lived in that territory for 1,500 years. Another fact is they are farmers and they are spread all over the landscape, so they have always been on 2/3 of the landscape.
The statement that has become an absolute cliche that the Serbs have taken over 70% of Bosnia. Again, the underlying assumption is that there were no Serbs in Bosnia before the conflict started, when in reality, much of the land of Bosnia was Serb land before the fighting ever began. But the implication is that the Serbs dropped in from some other planet and just took over nearly 2/3 of the country.
Based on what he now calls highly biased reporting, Kenny became a hardline critic of the Bosnian Serbs, whom he considered aggressors. In an influential opinion column in the New York Times, Kenny and U.S. Air Force General Michael Dugan argued that Bosnian Serbs should be bombed by NATO.
I personally was responsible for perhaps one of the most important things that the State Department did, labeling what was going on ethnic cleansing. I had tried to gin up public opinion, and part of my job was to draft material for the spokesman, Margaret Tutwiler. And she was always looking for inflammatory material. But in any case, my colleague in Belgrade sent me a cable one day saying the Serbs were doing what they described as ethnic cleansing. I thought, okay, this is great. I'll put this into Margaret Tutwiler's noon briefing. And to my surprise, no senior official took the words out.
The aggressors and extremists pursue a policy
a vile policy of ethnic cleansing.
From that point on, the term ethnic cleansing entered public discourse, but it was not in use before. And I think that that image somehow stuck, and then further down the road, people tried to convert that into an image of genocide, which doesn't really correspond to reality.
The reality was that all sides had been carrying out ethnic cleansing since the beginning of the war.
And there's ample evidence that that's going on in all sides. It's going on in the United Nations protected areas. It's going on in the areas of Bosnia.
Media perceptions influenced policies in Western countries towards Bosnia in ways that widened and prolonged the conflict. The one force capable of keeping order in Bosnia might have been the Yugoslav army, based in Sarajevo, which had the officers, men, and equipment to counter the many militias, Serb, Muslim, and Croat, that formed in the spring of 1992. General Kadijevic tried to do just that in meetings with leaders of all sides. However, under the threat of sanctions and pressed by the U.S., the JNA was forced to demobilize. In Sarajevo, most of the heavy weapons fell into the hands of Serbian forces, while in other areas, Croats and Muslims inherited JNA weapons and armament factories. Instead of a standing army which could be held accountable for keeping order, a lightly armed force of UN peacekeepers was given the nearly impossible mandate of separating the warring sides. UN General Louis Mackenzie criticized Serbian forces for their use of heavy artillery in areas of Sarajevo, but he also wrote later that most of the 19 ceasefires he had negotiated were broken by Muslim forces because their policy was and is to force the West to intervene.
There was an obvious short-term advantage in perpetuating the fighting in some areas in order to encourage the world to intervene. I don't think that's an illogical deduction at all, and I think most people would agree with that.
The fighting in Sarajevo was described by news organizations as a siege, but the reality was that of a divided city with front lines that changed little in the course of the war. Serbs fired from areas they held into areas controlled by Muslims, while Muslim forces fired into areas controlled by Serbs.
And I think people don't really understand that, in fact, Serbian community in Bosnia suffered in exactly the same way that the other two communities suffered.
Veteran military correspondents, such as Colonel David Hackworth of Newsweek, observed that with 300 tanks at their disposal, quote, taking out Sarajevo would be easier than sliding down a greased pole. General Mackenzie agreed that the Serbs could have captured the city in a matter of days early in the war, if that had been their intention.
Bearing in mind the ex-JNA equipment that was there, and as admitted by the presidential side, the overwhelming superiority in gunnery and in tanks that was available in Lukovica, then certainly a very formidable assault could be made against the city with a fairly good chance of success.
Many observers wondered why a government under siege would shell its own airport.
On several occasions, the UN documented and reported and made clear publicly 2 or 3 days later that there were cases where the Bosnians had been mortaring into areas where you wouldn't expect them to be mortaring, like the airport.
In his book, Balkan Odyssey, Lord Owen wrote that Muslim forces, quote, would from time to time shell the airport to stop relief flights, to focus world attention on Sarajevo.
Sarajevo became, after all, a sort of icon of the problems of Bosnia because there was a satellite dish which was shipped in very early on in the crisis. It was easy, if you like, to have ready access to the war on a day-by-day, real-time, instant, minute-by-minute basis if